The final film of the Disney sequel trilogy has finally been released, and to say that it's been divisive might be the understatement of the decade. I think it's pretty clear that Disney never had any kind of larger plan for the trilogy, and for whatever reason they thought that they could get away with just kind of winging it in what might be easily the most elaborate game of telephone that's ever been played, as we saw J.J. Abrams set up the board only for Rian Johnson to knock it over, then for J.J. to spend an hour in the Rise of the Skywalker to completely retcon almost everything seen in The Last Jedi. But I think the greatest tragedy in all this, and an even greater tragedy than Darth Plagueis the Wise, is how that after we've seen all the parts finally laid bare, you can see what could have been. That if the ultimate endpoint was known from the start, how this trilogy could have been much more stronger from the beginning till its inevitable and messy conclusion. So as the future remains uncertain for the galaxy far, far away, and the smoldering ashes of the second Death Star, I think now's as good of a time as any to see what the sequel trilogy could have been if only someone had took the time to actually make an outline and follow it for what was supposed to happen. You gotta love to be gone back yet. Love turns into time, don't you grab it. So in a previous video I made a while back on The Last Jedi, I made the point that the biggest problem was that nothing was ever really planned. Rian Johnson subverted everything that J.J. Abrams had been built up in The Force Awakens, and that this largely pissed off a large contingent of the Star Wars fanbase who'd been told that Supreme Leader Snoke was important, or the identity of Rey's parents was important as well, only to be laughed at that they were stupid for even being invested in any of those things, or even being angry that they were never paid off. So I've heard two different conflicting accounts in that regard. Some say that J.J. Abrams had an outline, but Rian Johnson threw it out and did whatever he wanted to do. Then supposedly Rian himself said that when he came aboard Star Wars, there was no outline or master story Bible whatsoever, and he was allowed to do whatever he wanted. Which account is true is something that we won't learn until the eventual Hollywood Reporter tell-all book comes out. But until I hear otherwise, I'm just going to go with the Rian Johnson story that there was nothing else because, think about it. Remember when the kings of turning terrible ideas into gold, Chris Lord and Phil Miller, were fired off of the Han Solo movie because they didn't stick to the script? Remember how that was such a terrible idea because right after that they literally won an Academy Award for the Spider-Man Enter the Spider-Verse movie? Well, let's just say if JJ had some very strong outline, I can't imagine that the guy who made Looper, Brick, and the Brothers Bloom would have the kind of clout needed to completely divest from the outline. So I'm going to assume that Mr. Abrams, the king of not finishing anything, didn't have much written up. How else could you justify retconning Palpatine's death and bringing him back in the final movie without any kind of foreshadowing in the previous two movies? But as much as I hate the idea of him coming back, I do think there's a kernel of a good idea that makes everything click. And that's the idea of Rey being related to Palpatine is the key that makes her a much more interesting character than she's been thus far. We keep on hearing about this Force dyad, a yin and yang between Rey and Kylo Ren, and Kylo is probably the most successful new character in the sequel trilogy, and what's made him so successful is the tension of him being a good guy who's trying to be bad. So what if Rey was a bad guy trying to be good? Suddenly things become much more interesting. All of the complaints about her being a Mary Sue evaporate, and we learn her unnatural gifts and talents come from an insidious dark bloodline. That she wants to win the day and save the galaxy from a new age of tyranny, but she finds herself adopting much more crueler and harsher methods to get the job done. Maybe as she continues to push things forward, seeking more and more power and taking more extreme measures, she finds it easier to tap into the darker aspects of the Force. This creates a lot of great new character stuff to play with, and it also helps strengthen another underutilized character, Finn. So Finn is an ex-Stormtrooper, but honestly, outside of his scene from The Force Awakens, the fact that he used to be a Stormtrooper doesn't really do much to affect his characterization in any interesting way outside of occasionally being able to drop exposition about the First Order. Poor old John Boyega tries to do the heavy lifting to make the character likable without a lot of material to work with, but he's just kind of generic adventure guy. Being an ex-Stormtrooper doesn't really affect his characterization, and we know that the First Order would basically enslave children to turn them into child soldiers. What if Finn believes that most of the Stormtroopers working for the First Order can be saved? What if he sees them as his friends and hates the idea that he has to shoot them down? Then we can get a much more interesting conflict between a guy who wants to reach out and save his former comrades versus someone like Rey who just wants to gun them down with a blaster or lightsaber. This setup leads to all kinds of juicy potential drama. Like maybe Rey and Finn get a bunch of stormtroopers to surrender, but it's a Mexican standoff where Rey wants information about a new super weapon or whatnot, but Finn wants to save the lives of his former friends, but she just wants to use Force lightning on the lot of them to get information they need. But then one of them stormtroopers tries to suicide bomb her, and she uses her Force lightning on all of them, turning Rey slowly into the kind of monster who does horrible things for the greater good as she feels drawn towards the more sinister aspect of her lineage, which makes her a much more interesting character. And let's say we still had that scene from The Last Jedi where she teams up with Kylo Ren in the throne room and kills Snoke and defeats all of his guards. Then he holds out his hand for her to join him, but instead she stabs him and tells the troops that he killed their Supreme Leader, then takes over the First Order, making herself the new Supreme Leader. Now that's a fun twist. Imagine a final movie with Rey believing she's the only one who could bring peace to the galaxy with the resources of the First Order. Then Kylo Ren is forced to become Ben Solo as he's cast out and forced to join the Resistance to try and stop her. The good guy who wants to be bad becomes good, and the good guy who feels more and more drawn to do bad things becomes the final villain doing horrible things to try and bring about a new peace. Now you have a rip-roaring finale worthy of closing out the 9-film saga that does something that we haven't quite seen before. Not only that, but imagine this. This movie isn't just the end of a sequel trilogy, it's also supposed to be the end towards the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, and there's a potential way you could tie all 40 years of storytelling together in one nice little bow. In the final, have Rey and Ben unite together to fight the big bad guy who's been controlling everything behind the scenes. Could be Palpatine, it could be the Darth Plagueis the Wise, you get the idea. Some external super dark side force that's the final boss who's been controlling everything in the galaxy for the past several decades. Rey and Ben defeat him utilizing both aspects of the Force, the dark and the light. They both learned the great mistake from the 2 previous generations in the film trilogies that came before. Originally, Anakin was the child of prophecy who was supposed to bring balance to the Force, but was there ever balance? In the 2 trilogies, all we ever saw were 2 extremes. One era where the light side was dominant to the point where it made all the Jedi into motionless puppets, who were too oblivious to see the machinations of the Sith Lord who was hanging out in the Senate right next to them. And in the following era, the dark side totalitarianism of the Empire. But hey, as Werner Herzog said in The Mandalorian, at least the starships ran on time.
The Empire improves every system it touches. Safety, prosperity, trade, opportunity, peace.
The true finale of the 9-film series is to understand that the Force is more complex than a simple, rigid binary. The dark side doesn't necessarily need to be malicious or evil, that embracing one's emotion and pride and ambition doesn't always have to be something wrapped up in evil and malice. And so, Rey and Kylo create a new dual-sided school to train Force-sensitive people on both sides of the Force. Through the light and dark sides finally understanding that is the only way to keep and maintain balance in the Force, is to explore and understand both aspects, rather than one side trying to perpetually conquer and extinguish the other. Anyone who's Force sensitive and crosses both sides and incorporates both aspects of the Force to become something beyond just a Jedi or Sith. They become something greater, something new, something the galaxy has never seen before. They become a Skywalker. From the family line that has experienced both extremes of the Force comes a new title for people attuned to the Force to try and attain, and thus a new school of thought and a new order of Force users is born to lead the galaxy into an exciting new era. It also ties into Luke's Last Jedi storyline better. It always felt a bit extreme that he should abandon everything just because his nephew went a little evil, when the whole point of his arc in the entire last trilogy was about being hopeful and assuming that even his father could be redeemed. But it makes much more sense for him to become a hermit if he feels that by creating a Jedi school, he was just inviting the same cycle of Jedi-Sith warfare to repeat again and continue into infinity ad nauseum. That's a much more depressing revelation that would serve his arc in rejection of the Jedi overall much better, and him guiding Rey to create a new school of thought serves as a better way to answer the age-old question of what should come next for the Galactic Order. But of course, all these choices can't be made until you have all the details on the table. You can't craft a satisfying narrative unless you know where your final destination and endpoint is, or at the very least, have a few ideas of broader points where you want the story to go. That's why everything feels so hollow. J.J. Abrams is the king of casting and great at casting the right people into roles. He's also great at making breathless action scenes that just keep the audience engaged like he did in the Star Trek reboot, where things are constantly moving forward. You never have a second to question any details, because there are so many lens flares, lights, and explosions, and it's just so goddamn entertaining that you don't have to think about it. Don't think too hard about the time travel or all the MacGuffins, but the problem is as entertaining as those stories might be when you're first watching them, they tend to hold very little weight as long-term narratives. Like, can you remember anything that happened in Star Trek 2009? Anyone out there? No cheating, no checking the Wikipedia page. It's a lot of noise and fury, but when you have that combined with the insufferable mystery box storytelling, then you don't really have a lot going for you in terms of creating a long-term narrative. And the lack of long-term world building hit the brick wall in the final film that felt like it was its own trilogy worth of content. The entire first hour feels like it was supposed to give the rollicking adventure for our 3 main leads that The Last Jedi was supposed to be, instead of splitting up the main cast. I've heard defenders say that they did the same thing in The Empire Strikes Back, the most beloved Star Wars movie, but the key difference is that the main cast stuck together and Luke left them to go find Yoda. Finn, Rey, Poe really needed to spend more time together in the second movie so you can feel a little bit more invested in them for the final film, but instead they spent most of the time apart, so JJ literally has them run around on a MacGuffin McMuffin hunt to try and give them that adventure bonding time that they didn't get before. Hell, even in hindsight, with everything laid bare, Rose Tico's purpose becomes much more clearer. Instead of hanging around Finn and going to Canto Bight, she should have been around Poe. It makes much more sense given the fact that he was the one who gave the orders that got her sister killed, and the character conflict between the two of heroic sacrifice versus living to see another sunset is better pronounced when you think about having those two characters come into conflict. It's much easier to build up a larger threat compared to just having the Emperor call up 1,000 Star Destroyers from nowhere with Death Star lasers. If all that was just lying around, what was the point of Snoke, the First Order, or even Starkiller Base? But that's the problem. When you have to end something that you never got a chance to start, there's nothing to pay off for, something that was never set up. One thing that the rise of streaming culture and binge viewing has made audiences much more interested in long-form serialized storytelling. There's no greater thrill than seeing a great satisfying payoff. Marvel's become the master of that. Obviously not everything is planned. The Thanos we got to see at the end of Avengers is a different beast than the Thanos we finally got in Infinity War, given the tease about him trying to court death like he does in the teaser, that was stripped down to him just worrying about resources. But when it was his time to shine, there was an audience ready to embrace him. And that's the key to making people care. Actually give them stakes and have them pay off. It also helps because it gives your characters better defined dynamics. It's funny that the nerdosphere was always accused of being innately bigoted and toxic and misogynistic. I'm not going to say that those aspects aren't present or innate in many different fan cultures, but at the same time you could look at something like Into the Spider-Verse, a movie filled with diversity that nobody complained about and received largely universal praise despite featuring the controversial biracial Miles Morales at the front and center. And the reason we don't see many protests or complaints is because of how carefully the film builds Miles' arc and uses other Spider people to ultimately support that arc as he undergoes his own Uncle Ben-style tragedy and comes to the realization that that tragedy is the tie that binds all the different Spider folk from different dimensions together, versus introducing him and saying, here's Miles Morales, he's Spider-Man, deal with it. What the sequel trilogy has left us with is a bunch of hollow characters. It's no wonder that John Boyega just does not seem to care anymore on social media, and now aggressively trolls people on Twitter and Instagram about Star Wars. I don't think there's anyone who dislikes the wasted potential of Finn more than he does. And you know he must really hate it, because God knows the poor guy hasn't earned the kind of Michael B. Jordan kind of clout to be burning as many bridges as he's currently torching. But there might still be hope. It's obvious the changes afoot, and the success of Jedi Fallen Order and The Mandalorian shows that people still really like and care about Star Wars. They just like it when it's managed by people who care as much as they do. That's the key that Kevin Feige learned while running Marvel. It's not about getting really high-level name brand directors to work behind the scenes. It's about getting the kind of people who really love the material. Nobody else would have given Joss Whedon a chance to direct a $200 million movie, but those are the risks that ultimately paid off, and while this trilogy may be dead and buried, as long as there's other people ready to move things forward, to tell new serialized stories in a galaxy far, far away, hope remains eternal that maybe someone like Dave Filoni will be finally given the chance to apply all the lessons he's learned making his Star Wars cartoons and The Mandalorian on a larger scale as he's freed from the CGI cartoon purgatory he's been kept in. But take a second, take a breather, put a little more time into the next one, Disney. Disney doesn't have to have a Star Wars movie out every year to keep it relevant. Sometimes a little break helps the heart grow fonder. If you build a nice serialized story, it doesn't have to feature an epic space battle every time. Sometimes something as simple as relatable as getting Baby Yoda home to his species is enough. If you take the time and chart out a long story with an arc, they will come and keep coming. That's how you save Star Wars and keep it as something that people love instead of constantly bicker and fight over. And as the Mandalorians would say,
This is the way.
This is the way.
thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about my take on how Rise of the Skywalker could have been saved or made much better if everything was planned from the beginning. Do you think my take is better or worse than Colin Trevor's? Let me know in the comments below. Who knows, maybe someday someone will steal my idea just like the CW and Warner Brothers did for their Crisis on Infinite Earth crossover for The Flash, where they had the Grant Gustin Flash meet the Urza Miller Flash. Yeah, that's right, I gave you that idea back in 2018. I remember. I don't forget. That's okay, you can keep stealing ideas from my videos. It's perfectly fine. But I would like to give a special thank you to the members of the Lobster Pod. Joseph Malty, Aaron Toney, and introducing Carla Hoffman. and Walking the Steps. These are the 4 generous contributors to the Lobster Pot. Thank you. You are the people who keep the dream alive, so thank you so much for your patronage. You make it all worthwhile, and if you want to join them and see the videos early, come on over, join my Patreon, join the Lobster Pot. It's only getting bigger. Everyone's welcome to come enjoy the metaphorical seafood feast of video essays that come from this channel. So come on in, throw in a buck, and join the Lobster Pot. And of course, do all the liking and the sharing and the commenting. I love that stuff, and helps the video. All the usual YouTube plugs. And thanks for sticking around. See you in the next one. And remember, lobster's antennas, but don't you grab it.